The obese girl lost her sight in the avalanche. The mountain man became her only guide. The winter of 1794 came to the Appalachian highlands like a vengeful spirit, wrapping the ridges in ice and silence. In those days, the frontier beyond the settled eastern states was a realm of towering forests, jagged peaks, and valleys so deep that sunlight touched their floors only at midday. It was a land where few white settlers dared to tread, and fewer still survived. Elijah Stone was one of those rare few who thrived in this wilderness. A mountain man by trade and temperament, he'd spent the better part of a decade trapping beaver and hunting deer in these isolated highlands. He was a man carved from the same granite as the mountains themselves, tall, broad-shouldered, with hands calloused from rope and rifle, and a face weathered by wind and cold. His cabin sat nestled in a high valley surrounded by pines so thick they formed natural walls against the winter storms. He preferred solitude. It was simpler than the company of men, who brought with them complications, expectations, and the bitter tang of disappointment. In the wilderness, a man knew where he stood. The rules were clear. Respect the land, stay alert, and survive. But fate, as Elijah would learn, cared little for a man's preferences. It was late November when he first encountered Mary Ann Fletcher. He'd been checking his trap lines near the lower valley when he heard voices rough, mocking, punctuated by cruel laughter. Following the sound, he emerged from the tree line to find a scene that made his jaw tighten with anger. A young woman stood surrounded by 4 men, their horses forming a loose circle around her. She was large, there was no delicate way to put it, with a round face flushed red from cold and humiliation, and a body that strained against the seams of her plain woolen dress. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins, hanging in disarray around her shoulders. The men were throwing insults at her like stones, each word designed to wound. Look at her, fat as a Christmas goose. Bet she ate all the wagon supplies herself. No wonder her family left her behind. Who'd want to haul that weight over the mountains? The woman's eyes brimmed with tears, but she held her chin up, refusing to crumble completely. There was something in that defiance, something that reminded Elijah of a wounded animal that still had fight left in its bones. He stepped into the clearing, his rifle held loosely but ready. That's enough. The men turned, assessing him with the casual arrogance of those who'd never truly been challenged. Their leader, a scarecrow of a man with tobacco-stained teeth, sneered. This ain't your concern, stranger. I'm making it my concern. Elijah's voice was quiet, but there was iron beneath the words. The ladies had enough of your company. Move along. For a moment, tension crackled in the cold air. Then the leader spat into the snow and jerked his head toward his companions. Come on, ain't worth the trouble. They rode off, their laughter echoing through the trees until distance swallowed it whole. Elijah turned to the young woman, who was now wiping at her eyes with trembling hands. You hurt? She shook her head, unable to speak past the tears that had finally broken free. He waited, patient as the mountains themselves, until she'd composed herself enough to explain. Her story came in fragments. Her name was Mary Ann Fletcher, daughter of a Pennsylvania farmer who decided to try his fortune in the Western Territories. The family had joined a small group of settlers heading toward the Ohio Valley, but the journey had been harder than anyone anticipated. Supplies ran low, tempers frayed, and Mary Ann, who'd always been heavy even as a child, became a convenient scapegoat for every hardship. When her father died of fever 2 weeks back, the other families made their position clear. She was too much of a burden. They left her at a trading post with a few coins and hollow wishes for good fortune, then disappeared westward without looking back. "I've been trying to find work," she said, her voice small and ashamed, "but no one wants." She gestured helplessly at herself. This. Elijah studied her in the fading afternoon light. Beneath the obvious distress, he saw something else, a will that hadn't quite broken, despite all efforts to crush it. The world, he knew, was full of people eager to judge what they didn't understand. He'd seen enough cruelty in his years to recognize it in all its forms. "Winter's coming on hard," he said finally. "No place for anyone to be alone. My cabin's about 6 miles north. You can shelter there till spring, if you've a mind to. I'll take no liberties, and I expect none in return. Just offering survival, nothing more." She stared at him as if he'd spoken in a foreign tongue. "Why would you help me?" "Because I can." He turned and started walking, coming or not. After a moment's hesitation, Mary Ann Fletcher gathered her small bundle of possessions and followed the mountain man into the wilderness. The cabin was exactly what one would expect of a solitary trapper's dwelling, small, sturdy, and sparse. A single room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, and a bed in the corner. Elijah gave her the bed without discussion, taking for himself a bedroll near the fire. The first weeks were awkward. Mary Ann tried to make herself useful, cooking the game he brought in and attempting to keep the cabin tidy, but she moved through the space like someone expecting punishment at every turn. She apologized constantly for taking up space, for breathing too loud, for existing. Elijah, unused to constant company, dealt with this by speaking only when necessary and spending long hours checking his trap lines. But gradually, in the way of all things given enough time, they established a rhythm. He taught her which plants could be used for tea, which animal tracks meant danger, which clouds promised snow. She, in turn, brought a kind of order to his chaotic existence, mending his clothes and organizing his supplies with a methodical efficiency he'd never possessed. "You don't talk much," she observed one evening as they sat by the fire, the wind howling outside like a pack of wolves. "Never saw the point in filling silence with noise." "Most people can't stand silence. It makes them uncomfortable." He glanced at her. "You uncomfortable?" She considered this. "No, not anymore." December arrived with unprecedented fury. Snow fell in sheets, piling up against the cabin walls until Elijah had to dig a path just to reach the woodpile. The temperature dropped so low that water froze in its bucket within minutes of being brought inside. For days at a time, they were trapped together in that small space, the outside world reduced to a white void beyond the shuttered windows. It was during these long, dark days that they began truly talking. Mary Ann spoke of her childhood in Pennsylvania, of a mother who died when she was young, and a father who'd loved her, but never quite known what to do with a daughter who didn't fit society's narrow definitions of acceptable. Elijah, surprising himself, told her of his own past, a family farm in Virginia, parents who'd wanted him to be something he wasn't, and the slow, suffocating realization that he'd never belong in civilized spaces. "I was always too much of something or not enough of something else," Mary Ann said quietly. "Never just right." "The world's got narrow ideas about what's right," Elijah replied. "Out here, all that matters is whether you can survive. Everything else is just noise." She looked at him then with something like wonder. "You really believe that?" "I do." It wasn't friendship exactly. Elijah wasn't sure he knew how to have friends anymore, but it was companionship. And in the brutal isolation of a mountain winter, that was more valuable than gold. January brought a brief warming trend. The snow softened, and weak sunlight broke through the perpetual cloud cover. Elijah decided to check the trap lines in the high valley, a day's journey from the cabin. Mary Ann insisted on coming along. "I need to learn this," she said firmly. "I can't just be useless." "You're not. Please." The word held such raw determination that he couldn't refuse. They set out at dawn, moving through snow that came up to Mary Ann's knees. She struggled, her breath coming in harsh gasps, but she didn't complain. Elijah adjusted his pace, showing her how to step, where to place her weight. By midday, they'd reached the high valley, a vast bowl surrounded by jagged peaks that pierced the winter sky like broken teeth. The beauty of it stopped Mary Ann in her tracks. "Oh," she breathed. "Oh, it's—" The world ended in a roar. Later, when Elijah tried to remember exactly what happened, his mind could only produce fragments. The sound like thunder, but deeper, more primal. The way the mountainside seemed to simply give way, releasing its burden of snow in a massive, unstoppable wave. Mary Ann's scream cut short. His own desperate lunge toward her, falling short by inches as the avalanche swept her away. Then the terrible, suffocating whiteness as the snow caught him too, tumbling him like a leaf in a flood, filling his mouth and nose and eyes until the world went black. He came to in silence so complete it was like being buried alive, which he realized with dawning horror he essentially was. Snow pressed against him from all directions, heavy and cold. Panic surged, but he forced it down. Panic killed. He needed to think. Moving slowly, fighting against the crushing weight, he managed to create a small air pocket near his face. Then, inch by agonizing inch, he began to dig. His hands were numb, his lungs screaming for air, but he kept moving. Up! He had to go up. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, his hand broke through into open air. He dragged himself out of the snow like a man emerging from a grave, collapsing onto the surface and sucking in great, desperate breaths. Mary Ann. The thought cut through his exhaustion like a knife. He staggered to his feet, looking around wildly. The valley was transformed, the avalanche having reshaped the entire landscape. Where there had been a gentle slope was now a massive field of debris snow mixed with broken trees, rocks, and scattered equipment. He found her by following the trail of disturbed snow. She was buried deep, only her arm visible above the surface. He dug with his bare hands, throwing snow aside with frantic speed, terror giving him strength he didn't know he possessed. When he finally uncovered her face, it was blue, not breathing. "No!" The word came out as a snarl. "No, damn you, no!" He cleared her mouth and nose, tilted her head back, and breathed into her lungs the way he'd once seen a doctor do for a drowned man. Once, twice, 3 times. Her chest rose and fell with his efforts, but she didn't respond. "Come on, Mary Ann, come on!" Again, again. On the 7th breath, she convulsed, coughing up snow and water. He turned her onto her side as she retched and gasped, each breath a miracle. When her breathing steadied, he pulled her close, wrapping his coat around them both. "I've got you. You're safe. I've got you." Her eyes fluttered open. For a moment, they seemed to focus on his face. Then confusion clouded them. She blinked, looked around, blinked again. Elijah. Her voice was barely a whisper. Elijah, I can't see anything. Why can't I see? His heart, which had just been returning to normal, stopped. What do you mean? Everything's dark, cloudy, like looking through fog, but her voice rose with panic. I can't see. He looked at her eyes. They were open, pupils responding to light, but there was something wrong with the way they moved, unfocused, wandering. A head injury, he thought. The avalanche must have. We need to get back to the cabin, he said, forcing his voice to stay calm. Can you walk? I don't know. I can't see where to walk. I'll guide you. Just hold on to me. The journey back was a nightmare. What had taken them half a day that morning took nearly 8 hours in return. Mary Ann stumbled and fell repeatedly, disoriented and frightened, while Elijah fought against his own exhaustion and growing dread. By the time they reached the cabin, both were on the verge of collapse. He got her inside, built up the fire until the room was blazing with warmth, and wrapped her in every blanket he owned. Then he examined her as best he could. No visible head wound, no blood. But her eyes, when he waved his hand in front of them, tracked only vaguely. Can you see anything at all? She squeezed her eyes shut, tears leaking out. Shapes, maybe. I'm not sure. It's all so dark. Elijah sat back, his mind racing. He'd heard of this happening before, people who'd been injured, struck in the head, or nearly drowned, losing their sight afterward. Sometimes it came back. Sometimes it didn't. It might be temporary, he said. Give it time to... And if it's not? Her voice cracked. What then? He didn't have an answer. The next days were the hardest Elijah had ever lived through, and he'd lived through plenty of hard days. Mary Ann seemed to shrink into herself, becoming a ghost of the woman he'd come to know. She barely ate. She sat by the fire, staring at nothing with those clouded, unfocused eyes, tears running silently down her face. At night, he heard her crying. She tried to be quiet about it, muffling the sound with her blanket, but the cabin was too small for secrets. On the 4th day, she spoke. Maybe you should take me back to town. He looked up from the knife he was sharpening. Why would I do that? I'm useless now. Worse than useless. I'm just a burden, like they always said. The knife clattered onto the table with more force than he intended. Mary Ann flinched at the sound. Don't! His voice was harsh. Don't you dare say that. It's true. It ain't true. He stood, moving closer, but not touching. You think this makes you useless? You think I measure a person's worth by their eyes? Everyone does. Well, I don't. He took a breath, trying to soften his tone. Mary Ann, look at me. I mean, listen to me. You're not a burden. You're not useless. And I'll be damned if I let you think otherwise just because the world threw another hardship your way. But I can't do anything anymore. I can't cook. I can't clean. I can't even walk across the room without stumbling into everything. So you'll learn. He pulled a chair close and sat down. You'll learn to do all those things without seeing. It'll take time, but you'll learn. And until you do, I'll help you. Why? The question came out as almost a wail. Why would you do that? Because the thought of sending her away made his chest hurt in ways he didn't understand. Because somewhere in the long winter months, she'd become important to him. because he'd spent years in solitude, thinking he preferred it, only to discover that maybe, just maybe, he'd been wrong. But he couldn't say any of that. So instead he said, "Because it's the right thing to do." She turned her face away, but he saw the tears on her cheeks. "I'm so scared, Elijah." "I know. What if it never comes back?" He reached out slowly and took her hand. She gripped it like a drowning person grips a rope. "If it doesn't come back," he said quietly, "then I'll be your eyes for as long as you need me to be." From that moment, something shifted. Mary Ann stopped apologizing for her existence and started fighting. Elijah, in turn, became her constant guide. He taught her to navigate the cabin by counting steps and feeling landmarks, the rough texture of the stone fireplace, the smooth wood of the table, the draft from the window. When she burned herself on the fire, he showed her how to gauge heat with her hand held at a safe distance. When she knocked over a bucket of water, he helped her clean it up and then taught her to place things in consistent locations so she'd always know where they were. 3 steps from the bed to the table, he'd say, his voice patient and steady. 2 steps from the table to the fireplace. Remember the pattern. Slowly, painfully, she learned. There were setbacks, days when frustration overwhelmed her, and she broke down sobbing. But there were also victories. The first time she successfully prepared a meal without help, Elijah ate every bite and praised it like it was a feast fit for kings, even though the stew was oversalted and the bread burned on one side. "It's terrible," she said, but there was something like pride in her voice. "It's perfect," he replied, and meant it. As winter deepened into February, their relationship transformed in ways neither could quite articulate. Elijah found himself describing everything to her the way snow fell in the mornings, sparkling like diamonds in the weak sunlight, the pattern of frost on the windows, the shape of clouds building over the peaks. He'd never been a man of many words, but for Mary Ann he became a storyteller, painting the world in language, and she listened, not just to his words, but to him learning the rhythm of his breathing, the sound of his footsteps, the subtle changes in his voice that indicated mood. She began to know when he was tired, when he was worried, when he needed silence instead of conversation. One evening, as they sat by the fire, she reached out tentatively. Her fingers found his arm, traced up to his shoulder, then gently touched his face. He froze, barely breathing, as she explored the planes and angles of his features, the roughness of his beard, the sharp line of his jaw, the small scar above his left eyebrow. "I can't remember what you look like anymore," she whispered. "The memory's fading, so I need—" She faltered. "Is this all right?" "Yes." The word came out rough. Her fingers moved across his face with careful attention, committing him to memory through touch. When she finally lowered her hand, there were tears in those clouded eyes again, but different tears than before. "I can't see your face anymore," she said softly, "but I've never known you clearer than I do now." Something broke open in Elijah's chest, something he'd kept locked away for so many years. He'd almost forgotten it was there. Without thinking, he reached out and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. They sat like that until the fire burned low, neither speaking, both understanding that something had fundamentally changed between them. March arrived with the first hints of thaw. Ice began to melt from the eaves, creating a constant symphony of dripping water. The snow, which had been pristine and unchanging for months, took on a grayish, granular quality as it slowly retreated. With the warming weather came possibilities. Word had reached Elijah through a passing trapper that a traveling doctor, a real physician, trained in Philadelphia, was making his way through the mountain settlements, treating injuries and ailments. He'd be in the nearest town, about 2 days' journey south, for most of April. Elijah shared this news with Mary Ann carefully, not wanting to raise hopes that might be crushed, but she seized onto the information like a lifeline. "Could he help?" she asked. "Could he bring back my sight?" "I don't know," Elijah answered honestly, "but he'd know more than I do. Might be worth the journey once the pass is clear." They prepared carefully. By mid-April, the trail was navigable, though still treacherous in places where snow remained. Elijah fashioned a walking stick for Mary Ann from smooth pine and tied a piece of soft leather around the handle so she could grip it comfortably. They practiced for days short walks around the cabin, then longer excursions into the woods, until she could navigate uneven terrain with something approaching confidence. The journey to town took 3 days instead of 2. Elijah moved at Mary Ann's pace, describing obstacles before they reached them, guiding her around rocks and roots and streams swollen with snowmelt. She fell only twice, and both times she got up without complaint, brushing off her skirts and reaching for his steadying hand. The town, barely more than a collection of rough buildings scattered along a muddy road, held few comforts. But it had a doctor, and that was all that mattered. Dr. Samuel Harrison was a thin, scholarly man in his 50s, with wire-rimmed spectacles and gentle hands. He listened to Mary Ann's story with careful attention, asked numerous questions, and then performed an examination that lasted nearly an hour. Finally, he sat back and removed his spectacles, cleaning them slowly while he considered his words. "The optic nerves appear intact," he said. "The eyes themselves show no obvious damage, yet clearly your vision is profoundly impaired." "What does that mean?" Elijah asked, his hand finding Mary Ann's shoulder. "It means the injury was likely to the brain rather than the eyes themselves. The avalanche, the lack of oxygen, these things can cause damage we cannot see." He paused. "The good news, if we can call it that, is that I've seen cases like this where vision returned partially or even fully over time. The brain is remarkable in its ability to heal." "How long?" Mary Ann's voice was barely audible. "There's no way to know. Weeks, months, perhaps longer, or—" He let the sentence trail off, but the implication was clear. "Or never," she finished. Dr. Harrison reached out and patted her hand. "I won't lie to you, miss. It's possible your sight may never fully return. But I've also seen miracles. The key is to keep fighting, keep challenging yourself." And he glanced at Elijah. Having someone strong to guide you through the darkness doesn't hurt. As they left the doctor's office, Mary Ann was quiet. Elijah waited, giving her space to process. Finally, as they stood on the muddy main street, she spoke. "At least now I know," she said. "At least there's maybe hope." "There's always hope," Elijah replied. She turned toward his voice, and even though her eyes couldn't quite focus on him, there was something fierce and determined in her expression. "Then let's go home." The word hung between them. Home. Not your cabin or back to the mountains. Home. "Yeah," Elijah said softly. "Let's go home." The journey back was slower than the journey out, but neither minded. Spring was fully emerging now, transforming the landscape. Elijah described it all, the wildflowers pushing through the last patches of snow, the return of birds filling the forest with song, the way the streams roared with enthusiasm as they carried the mountain's winter burden down to the valleys below. "Tell me about the colors," Mary Ann requested one afternoon as they rested beside a creek. Elijah considered. He'd never been poetic, but for her, he tried. "The flowers are small, mostly purple and yellow. The purple's deep, like midnight sky just before it turns full black. And the yellow's bright as the sun, so bright it almost hurts to look at. They're scattered everywhere, like someone threw handfuls of colored stars across the ground." She smiled, eyes closed, face turned toward the sun. "I can almost see it when you describe it like that. The aspens are budding, too. The leaves aren't full out yet, just these tiny green things, bright and new. And the sky." He looked up, searching for words. "It's blue, but not like anything else. Clearer than water, deeper than, hell, I don't know what. Just blue. Perfect blue." "I miss blue," she whispered. He took her hand. "I'll keep describing it for you. Every shade, every variation. I'll describe it all until you can see it again, even if it's just through my words." She squeezed his fingers. "Promise?" "Promise." They reached the cabin in early May. The valley was a riot of spring life birds nesting in the eaves, wildflowers covering the meadow, the creek running high and clear. Elijah had worried that Mary Ann might find the return depressing, a reminder of her limitations. Instead, she seemed to blossom. She learned to tend the small garden plot with her hands as guides, feeling the difference between vegetable sprouts and weeds. She learned to distinguish birds by their calls, creating a mental map of the forest through sound. She could navigate the cabin now without any help, moving through the space with confidence born of repetition and memory. But more than that, she seemed happy, not the desperate, fragile happiness of someone trying to convince themselves they're fine, but genuine contentment. She sang while she worked. She laughed at Elijah's dry observations about the local wildlife. She started initiating conversations about topics beyond mere survival. One evening, as they sat outside watching the sunset, or rather, as Elijah watched and described it, she turned the tables on him. "What do you see when you look at me?" she asked. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I see strength. The kind that doesn't come from never being knocked down, but from getting back up every time. I see someone who refused to let the world define her. I see—" He paused, unsure if he should continue. "What?" she prompted softly. "I see someone I can't imagine living without." She turned toward him, her unfocused eyes shining with unshed tears. "Elijah, I know I ain't much. Just a mountain man with a rough cabin and rougher edges. And I know you're dealing with enough without me adding complications. But Mary Ann, these months with you, they've been the best of my life. And if you'll have me, if you'll stay not just till spring or till your sight comes back, but permanently, I'd like that. I'd like that a lot." "Are you asking me to marry you?" Her voice trembled. "I suppose I am. I ain't doing it very well, but yes, that's what I'm asking." She reached out, her hand finding his face with the practice of months. "You foolish man," she whispered. "Don't you know I've been in love with you since February?" "You have? How could I not be? You gave me back my life when I'd lost everything. You never made me feel like a burden, never treated me like I was broken. You became my eyes, yes, but more than that, you became my home." Tears were streaming down her face now. "So yes, yes, I'll marry you 1,000 times, yes." He kissed her then, gentle and reverent, tasting salt from her tears and feeling something in his chest expand until he thought it might burst. When they finally pulled apart, both were crying and neither cared. They married in June with only the forest as witness. A traveling preacher came through the valley on his circuit, and Elijah flagged him down almost desperately. The ceremony was simple vows exchanged under the open sky, rings fashioned from braided silver wire, a kiss that felt like a promise of forever. Mary Ann wore a dress of plain blue cotton that Elijah had traded for in town. He'd described it to her in detail, the color of a summer sky, with tiny white buttons down the front. She couldn't see it, but she ran her hands over the fabric with obvious pleasure. "It's beautiful," she declared. "Not as beautiful as you," Elijah replied, and meant every word. The summer passed in a blur of contentment. They fell into the rhythms of married life easily, as if they'd been doing this for years rather than months. Elijah taught Mary Ann to fish by feel, her hands learning to read the tension in the line. She taught him songs from her childhood, her voice sweet and clear in the mountain air. In August, Mary Ann woke Elijah before dawn, her hand shaking his shoulder urgently. "What's wrong?" He was instantly alert, reaching for his rifle. "Nothing's wrong, Elijah. I can see light." He froze. "What?" "The window. I can see that it's lighter than the wall. I can see the glow of the coals in the fireplace." Her voice rose with excitement. "It's not clear. It's all blurry and vague, but I can see light." He lit a candle with shaking hands, holding it up. "Can you see this?" She turned toward it, squinting. "Yes, a bright blur, but yes, I can see it." Over the following weeks, her vision continued to improve. Slowly, frustratingly slowly, but undeniably. The vague shapes sharpened into forms. Colors began to differentiate. By September, she could make out Elijah's face when he stood close, though details remained fuzzy. "You have a beard," she said one morning, touching his face and looking at it simultaneously. "I'd forgotten you had a beard." "Had it the whole time you've known me," he replied, grinning. "I know, but touching isn't the same as seeing. You're more handsome than I remembered." "Now I know your sight's still damaged. Must be seeing things wrong." She swatted his shoulder, laughing. "Don't fish for compliments, mountain man." By October, when the aspens turned gold and the air carried the first hints of coming winter, Mary Ann's vision had returned enough that she could navigate independently, read if the light was good, and distinguish faces at a distance. Dr. Harrison, visiting the valley to check on her progress, declared it remarkable. "I've rarely seen such significant recovery," he admitted, "though I suspect it wasn't just time that healed you." "What do you mean?" Mary Ann asked. The doctor smiled. "The will to heal is powerful medicine, and having someone to fight for someone who believes in you that's more potent than any remedy I could prescribe." After he left, Elijah and Mary Ann stood on the porch of their cabin, watching the sun set over the peaks. She could see it now, the brilliant oranges and reds, the deep purples of the distant mountains, the first stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "It's even more beautiful than you described," she said softly. "Some things words can't quite capture," he agreed. She leaned against him, his arm coming around her naturally. "You know what's strange? I'm grateful." "For what?" "For the avalanche. for losing my sight. She felt him stiffen and hurried to explain, not because of the blindness itself, but because of what it taught me. I spent so much of my life thinking I wasn't good enough because of how I looked, and then I lost my sight, and I had to learn who I was without relying on appearances, mine or anyone else's. I had to learn to trust, to accept help, to believe I had value beyond what eyes could see. She turned to look up at him, her vision still not perfect, but clear enough to see the love in his face. And most of all, I learned what real love looks like, not the kind based on beauty or perfection, but the kind that sees you at your worst, your weakest, your most broken, and says, "I choose you anyway." Elijah pulled her closer, resting his chin on top of her head. "I always choose you." "I know," she smiled against his chest. "That's why I'm grateful." 2 years later, in the spring of 1796, Elijah and Mary Ann stood in the meadow behind their cabin, watching their daughter take her first steps. Little Hannah, named after Mary Ann's mother, had her father's dark hair and her mother's determined expression. At 14 months old, she was fearless, tottering toward her mother with complete confidence that someone would catch her when she fell. Mary Ann's sight had continued to improve, though it would never be quite what it had been before the avalanche. She wore spectacles now when she needed to read, and bright light sometimes gave her headaches. But she could see her daughter's face, could watch the seasons change across the valley, could meet her husband's eyes across the room and read everything he felt in a single glance. They'd expanded the cabin, adding a second room for Hannah and space for the second child they were expecting come autumn. A few other families had settled in the valley over the past year, drawn by tales of good land and clear water. Mary Ann had become an unlikely source of wisdom for the settlement, particularly for women struggling with hardship. Who better to offer advice on perseverance than someone who'd quite literally walked through darkness and emerged into light? "She's going to be trouble, this one," Elijah observed, scooping up Hannah as she reached them. "Got too much of your stubbornness." "My stubbornness?" Mary Ann laughed. "She gets that entirely from you." "Impossible. I'm easy going as a summer day." "You're impossible as a winter storm and twice as stubborn." He grinned, bouncing Hannah on his hip. "You love it." "I really do." Later, after Hannah had been put down for her nap, they stood together in the doorway of their cabin, looking out at the valley that had become their home. The same mountains that had nearly killed Mary Ann now sheltered them. The wilderness that might have swallowed her whole had instead become the place where she found herself. "Do you ever miss town?" Elijah asked. "Having neighbors close by, shops, people?" She considered the question seriously. "Sometimes, but mostly no. Everything I need is right here." "You sure about that? Because if you ever wanted to move—" She pressed her fingers to his lips, silencing him. "Elijah Stone, I have never been more sure of anything in my life. This valley, this cabin, you, this is where I belong. This is where I choose to be." He kissed her fingers, then pulled her close. "Good, because I wasn't really planning on going anywhere." "I know." She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "You're my constant, remember? My guide, my home." "Always," he promised. And as the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that Mary Ann could now see with her own eyes, they stood together, the mountain man and the woman who'd found her strength in darkness, the unlikely pair who discovered that love wasn't about perfection, but about choosing each other every single day. In the years that followed, they would face other challenges, harsh winters, difficult harvests, the ordinary struggles of raising children in the wilderness, but they would face them together, and that would make all the difference. Because Mary Ann had learned a truth that darkness had taught her. Sometimes you have to lose your sight to truly learn how to see. And what she saw, clearer than anything else, was that she was home, not just in this valley or this cabin, but in Elijah's arms, in his steady presence, in the life they'd built from snow and stubbornness and unwavering faith in each other. She was home, and she could see that now, perfectly clear.